She'd waited more than a month, and then asked, "Why hasn't the cowboy ever claimed me?" Out here on the brutal frontier, where dust storms swallowed the horizon whole, stood a lone, weather-beaten cabin. Inside it lived Jonah Reed, a gunslinger with a blood-stained past, sharing the roof with Eliza Moore, a young woman fleeing the powerful Harrington family. For over a month they had lived side by side, in silence, in distance, in fear and suspicion. Eliza wondered, why hadn't he, the man who once saved her life, ever stepped across that invisible line to claim her as his own? Was it indifference? Or a wound buried so deep in Jonah's soul that she had yet to touch it? The tale begins with that seemingly simple question. But behind it lies a secret of blood and fire, and a reckoning with the past that cannot be outrun. The cabin stood alone on the rim of desolation, a forgotten shadow carved out of rough-hewn logs darkened by sun and sandstorms. All around stretched a barren expanse, cracked earth, tufts of wiry grass, scattered stones, and no tree tall enough to soften the cruel horizon. The wind howled, carrying red dust and swirling devils, making the place feel even more forsaken. Jonah Reed came trudging back from the dry well, shoulders bent beneath the weight of a brimming water bucket. The sun was sinking, a dying ember burning down to ash along the skyline, throwing a weary red glow over his frame. Each step landed heavy, boots dragging on the rugged ground. Sweat streaked his weathered face, and his hollow eyes carried the gloom of a man who had seen too much blood and fire. No words were needed. His gait alone told of burdens a lifetime deep. Inside, Eliza Moore sat by a small fire, stirring a pot of beans that bubbled thick and slow. Smoke curled upward, clinging to her tangled, tawny hair. Her hands were raw, skin reddened by lye soap and brackish well water. Fingers trembled slightly each time she worked the wooden spoon, but she kept the rhythm steady, as if cooking was the only thing tethering her to the present. The marks of flight still lingered on her thin shoulders, and her eyes held a quiet dread she could not shake. For over a month now, that cabin had been their prison and their shelter both. They were not man and wife, nor lovers, just two scarred souls thrown together by chance. Each carried silence like a shield, guarding pasts too heavy to lay bare. Jonah set the bucket down. The dull thud against the plank floor echoed through the cramped space. He slumped into a chair, head bowed, gaze fixed on the boards, as though he'd cut all ties with the world outside. Eliza glanced at him once, then lowered her eyes back to the beans, feigning busyness. Between them stretched a silence thick as chimney smoke, no words spoken, yet every small movement, every stolen look, brimmed with unspoken caution. Outside, the wind whistled through the cracks in the log walls, a thin shriek like a warning. Inside, the firelight flickered across two strangers' faces, illuminating the gulf between them. A solitary cabin, a man with blood on his hands, a woman still haunted by fear. Together, under one frail roof, where silence said more than words ever could. Eliza's eyes drifted to the bubbling beans, but in her mind rose other sounds, the raucous laughter of men at the saloon, the leering stares that clawed at her like hungry wolves. Since the day her parents died, she had scraped by on odd jobs, a young woman alone in a land that respected no such thing. To the Harringtons, the wealthiest, most ruthless clan in the territory, she was nothing more than a trinket to be seized, a plaything to be passed around. The memory of that night in the saloon returned, sharp as a fresh wound. The stench of whiskey, the twang of banjo strings, the crash of chairs, and then a rough hand clamped around her wrist, dragging her toward the dark beyond the counter. Panic had clawed her throat, until Jonah Reed appeared. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't warned. Just one bone-crushing punch, the flash of cold steel from his holster, and the room went dead quiet. From that moment on, her fate and Jonah's were bound together. Jonah hadn't asked where she was going. He hadn't made promises. He simply led her out of town and chose an abandoned cabin on the edge of nowhere. For a month they survived, not on affection, but necessity. Eliza knew Jonah wasn't staying out of love. He was paying a debt to his own conscience, as if shielding her was the only penance left for the sins that shadowed him. Still, in the long nights, Eliza watched him, how his gaze lingered on the darkness beyond the window, how his hand always hovered near the gun at his side, even when the world outside was silent. Sometimes he seemed cold enough to freeze the air around him, and yet that very coldness made her feel safe. Strange how the man built of violence was the only shield between her and ruin. But Eliza carried a secret, a truth she dared not speak. For the man who tried to drag her into the saloon's shadows wasn't just some drunk. He was the eldest Harrington son, a man with old scores to settle with Jonah Reed. A blood feud long buried but never forgotten. Eliza's fingers tightened on the wooden spoon, letting the heat sear her raw hands. She bit her lip, swallowing the terror twisting in her chest. The silence between them, once harmless, now hung like a mask, hiding a storm ready to break. So I'll ask you this. If you stood where they stood, whose side would you take? A. Jonah Reed. Eliza Moore, or do you have another choice? Drop a comment and let me know you're still riding with this story. Night fell hard on the wasteland, cold, heavy, and unwelcoming. Wind hissed through the cracks of the cabin, carrying dust and loneliness. Somewhere far off, wolves raised their mournful cries, echoing across the barren hills, a dirge that stretched on through the endless dark. Inside that darkness, Eliza Moore curled up on the narrow cot, staring wide-eyed at the sagging rafters. Sleep would not come. Each distant howl squeezed her chest tighter, a reminder of the danger that circled, unseen but ever near. By the wall, close to the door, Jonah Reed sat motionless on a rickety chair. Firelight flickered in the hearth, throwing his shadow long and rigid across the wall, like a statue carved to guard the night. In his hand rested a revolver, steel glinting faintly, the grip worn smooth by years of use. His eyes were open, but they weren't fixed on anything in the room. They seemed to pierce the dark, staring into some far-off place where the past refused to stay buried. Eliza glanced at him, then looked away. She knew he was awake, listening to every sound. In this cabin, silence didn't mean peace. It was a shroud, hiding 100 unspoken things. She longed to break it, to speak, to breach that wall of cold distance, but the words caught in her throat. Was Jonah here only out of duty? Or was there something more? Another wolf's cry split the night, closer now, fiercer. Eliza pulled the ragged blanket tight to her chest, squeezing her eyes shut. In her mind flashed the greedy stares of the Harrington men, the brute hand that once tried to drag her into shadow. A shiver raked down her spine. She wanted to believe Jonah's presence was a fortress strong enough to hold, but fear whispered otherwise. If he chose to leave one day, what would be left of her? Jonah shifted, the chair creaking under him. He sat hunched, weighed down by memories no one else could see. Faces of the dead, the screams, the nights drenched in blood, each ghost passing before him. His hands had claimed too many lives. He feared that if he stepped too close to another soul, all he'd give them was the curse of his shadow. Time stretched cruel and endless in that cabin. The pop of firewood, the wolves' cries, the moan of wind. Two souls wide awake, hearts pounding, one heavy with fear, the other with guilt, sharing the same silence, wondering if it would bind them together or tear them apart. Dawn finally spilled across the barren land, stripping it bare instead of warming it. Eliza stepped outside with a battered wooden pail. The well wasn't far, but each step felt chained by the dread that lingered from the night. The howls still echoed in her head, but worse than that was the crawling sense of being watched. The morning wind tugged her hair, carrying the raw scent of dust and earth. She shivered. At the well, she knotted the rope tight around the bucket and lowered it slowly. The hollow splash rose up, drumming against the morning stillness. Each pull of the rope, she cast her eyes around the dry plain. Nothing. Just brittle grass and stone. And yet her chest felt heavy, as if unseen eyes were fixed on her. Cold water sloshed up, soaking her faded dress as she hauled the pail with trembling, raw hands. Near the corral, Jonah tended, his black stallion. His movements were steady, deliberate, hand brushing down the horse's flank, adjusting the saddle, tugging the cinch strap firm. But his eyes never stopped sweeping the horizon. Watchfulness was carved into him, the habit of a man who had lived too long with danger breathing down his neck. Jonah knew peace was a lie. Eliza watched him quietly, then dropped her gaze. Her heart twisted with the realization Jonah wasn't just guarding against what lay beyond. He was holding back something inside himself. She could see it in the tightness of his shoulders, in the haunted depth of his stare. Perhaps he feared that one misstep would drag him back into the man he used to be, the man who left only blood and ashes in his wake. Jonah wiped the sweat from his brow, then froze. Just beyond the corral fence, pressed into the dust, was a print. He crouched, eyes narrowing. A boot track, fresh, from the night before. This land was empty. No one had reason to pass through. Yet someone had crept close enough to touch the cabin's edge. Jonah's hand fell to the revolver at his hip, instinctively tight. His pulse quickened, not with fear, but with grim certainty. His instincts had been right all along. They were no longer alone. He straightened slowly, eyes darkening, scanning the horizon once more. Eliza, clutching the heavy pail, felt a chill run down her spine when she saw his face. She didn't yet know what he had found, but his look was warning enough. The dread she'd carried for weeks, was it finally standing at their doorstep? So I'll ask you this. If you were in their place, whose side would you stand on? A. Jonah Reed. Eliza Moore. Or do you choose another path? Leave a comment, and let me know you're still riding with the story. That supper was so quiet, Eliza could hear the spoon tap against the tin bowl. The beans carried their sharp scent, tangled with the smoke from the smoldering firewood. The cabin felt strangled by silence, thick enough that even a breath weighed more than it should. Eliza sat across the table, hands trembling as she set down her dish. Her palms burned with heat, yet sweated cold. Jonah kept to his old habit. Head bowed, eyes fixed on a crust of stale bread rather than the woman before him. His shadow flickered long against the logs, solid, distant, unreachable. In that stillness, Eliza felt suffocated, pressed against the wall of secrets he refused to crack open. At last, she broke. Her voice was so faint it startled even herself, like a whisper not meant to be heard. Why is it you never sleep through the night? The sound rippled through the cabin like a stone dropped in still water. Jonah froze, spoon hovering mid-air. The pause stretched long enough that Eliza nearly wished she could swallow the words back down. Then slowly, his eyes lifted, deep and hollow, and met hers for the briefest moment. Because I know what's out there. 6 words. Cold, sharp, final, like a knife cutting through air. No comfort, no softening, just truth, bare and brutal. Eliza stiffened, fingers clutching the edge of the table. His answer wasn't reassurance. It was a warning. In that instant, she felt both trust and fear. Trust, because Jonah was no fool. He was always ready for danger. Fear, because those words pulled back the veil on a past he never spoke of. A past soaked in blood, carved into his gaze, shadowing him with a darkness that would not die. Firelight danced across Jonah's face, etching the hard lines deeper. The silence after his words weighed heavier than the words themselves. Eliza could sense the war inside him, the killer's instinct that still prowled within, locked in battle with the desperate will to bury it. She longed to press further, to force him open. But her lips stayed shut. Her heart ached with the question that clawed at her. Was Jonah truly here for her, or was he only wrestling his own ghosts? Outside, the wind slammed the cabin walls, shrieking like a reminder. Inside, silence settled again, heavier than ever. And Eliza knew her question was only the beginning, the first of many unspoken words that could either bind them or doom them both to the same fate. By midday, Jonah Reed saddled his horse, holstered his gun, and rode out without a word. Eliza stood on the porch, watching his figure shrink down the red dust road. She knew why he went. The flour jar was empty, the last cartridges nearly gone. Yet dread coiled in her chest. That town was no place she dared set foot again, and now Jonah was carrying her name into the teeth of every watching eye. Near sundown, hoofbeats thundered back across the plain. Eliza flinched, heart racing. Jonah appeared, coated in dust, tying off his horse before stepping inside. He dropped a sack of flour and a box of bullets onto the table. But his eyes, they weren't the same. Darker, tighter, as if he'd dragged a storm back with him. "Something happened?" Eliza asked, her voice trembling. Jonah paused, then fixed her with a look, his voice low, steady as stone. "In town, your name came up. Folks say the Harringtons are asking questions, asking straight about a missing woman and a cowboy at her side." Eliza froze. Her lips quivered, her throat knotted. The truth she'd buried could no longer hide. Tears pricked her eyes as she drew a breath, then confessed. "One of them. He tried to force himself on me. That night, if not for you, I wouldn't have gotten out." The air in the cabin thickened. Jonah's eyes flared with something fierce, then dimmed like a fire strangled in its own smoke. He turned away, hand clenching his revolver's grip as though holding himself back from unleashing fury. Eliza sat trembling, waiting for his reaction. But Jonah stood as still as a stone statue. Firelight painted his face, shifting with shadows, unreadable. Eliza dared not ask, but she sensed. His silence wasn't just about her confession. In his mind, another face had risen. The Harrington man, an old comrade. Once they'd ridden side by side in the outlaw days, carving their names in blood and gunfire, until betrayal split them apart. And now fate had dragged them back onto opposite ends of the barrel. Jonah drew a long breath, trying to shove the ghosts aside, but his eyes sharpened, carrying a silent resolve. Harrington's name wasn't just Eliza's doom. It was the summons of his own past. Eliza sat with her hands locked tight, shaking. She didn't know what Jonah would choose in that silence, to keep protecting her, or to walk away before past and present collided in a storm of blood. "So tell me this. If you were there, whose side would you take? A. Jonah Reed. Eliza Moore, or would you choose another path? Drop a comment and let me know you're still riding with this story." That evening, the sun sank low, bleeding red across the horizon, painting the wasteland with a heavy, ominous glow. Jonah stepped out onto the cabin porch, eyes sweeping the edges of the earth. He meant to check the stack of firewood by the door, then stopped cold. There, tied to one of the porch posts, was a strip of black cloth, small, frayed, too deliberate to be chance. It reeked of smoke, still damp as if it had been left only moments ago. Jonah pulled it free, fist clenching around it. His throat tightened. This wasn't a warning. It was a declaration. The enemy had stood right at their threshold, close enough to leave a sign and slip away unseen. A silent message, cold as death itself. "We've found you." Eliza stepped out, catching the look on Jonah's face. Her lips trembled as her eyes fell on the cloth in his hand. "No, don't tell me. Someone has—" Her voice broke, unfinished. Jonah didn't answer. He carried the cloth inside and set it on the table. In that cramped room, the rag seemed alive, an eye watching them both. Eliza backed away, clutching at the chair's edge, until tears burst free. "I can't hide it anymore." Her voice cracked, shoulders shaking. That night in the saloon, it wasn't just crude words. He tried to drag me away. If you hadn't come, I don't know what would have happened. She buried her face in her hands, tears dripping onto the gray floorboards, shame and terror flooding out after weeks of silence. Jonah stood still for a long time, face hard, eyes black as a moonless night. His breathing came rough, but he didn't cut her off, didn't offer soft comfort. He let her speak, let her spill the weight that had chained her for so long. When the sobbing quieted, his voice came, low, steady, iron-bound. "Running won't save us. They'll hunt to the end." Eliza lifted her head, eyes red, staring at him through trembling lashes. She heard the naked truth in his words. The enemy would never stop. But beneath that truth she caught something else, a vow, unspoken but clear. Jonah wasn't leaving. He wasn't running. His choice had been made, and that choice meant bracing for blood. Outside, the evening wind tore through the desert, flinging red dust against the cabin walls. Inside, the two sat in silence, knowing the line of safety had been erased forever. The sun dropped fast, sky turning to ash gray. In the cabin, the black cloth still lay on the table, heavy as a curse. Eliza sat quiet, eyes swollen from tears, while Jonah lingered at the porch, his hand resting near the revolver at his side. Both could feel it. The enemy was no longer far. They were coming closer with every breath. Suddenly, hoofbeats echoed across the plain, heavy, steady. Eliza jolted, heart hammering. Through the small window she saw a lone rider approaching, a stranger on a dust-streaked brown horse. A dark cloak draped his shoulders, and he rode upright, arrogant, like a man who knew his presence alone could stir fear. Jonah stepped onto the porch, eyes fixed cold on the rider. When the distance narrowed just enough for faces to show, Jonah's voice cut the air, deep and calm. "That's close enough." The stranger tugged the reins. His horse slowed, snorting. A crooked grin spread across the man's face. "No need for nerves, Reed. Word's been going round about a woman hiding out here. Thought I'd ride by, see if she might be in need of company." Eliza shrank back, trembling at the oily tone. Jonah's gaze never wavered. His revolver was already half drawn, steel flashing in the dying light. His words came sharp, deadly as a blade. "She doesn't, and you won't be back." The silence that followed was thick as gunpowder, broken only by the wind's howl and the creak of saddle leather. The stranger smirked, eyes flicking toward the cabin as though peering through its walls. "Easy now, just talking." But his gaze lingered, sly. Seems the rumors weren't wrong after all. Jonah raised the gun higher, voice hard enough to break stone. Ride away, or your horse goes home without you. The man chuckled low, rasping, then yanked the reins. His horse wheeled in a slow circle. Eliza exhaled shakily, but her eyes clung to him. And that's when she saw it. A detail small, but chilling. Around his neck, the cloak's edge was torn, and on that frayed fabric was a faint, hand-stitched letter. M. Her blood ran cold. She remembered Jonah's rare mutterings of his outlaw days, of the gang that once set the West ablaze. That mark was their sign, which meant this rider wasn't just tied to the Harringtons. He carried with him the ghosts of Jonah's past. Eliza turned to Jonah, but he hadn't moved. He stood rigid, eyes like ice, locked on the fading figure of the rider. Eliza's hands clenched tight, trembling with the truth she now understood. The enemy wasn't after her alone. They were here for Jonah, too. Past and present were closing their jaws together around this fragile cabin. So tell me this. If you were there, whose side would you take? A. Jonah Reed. B. Eliza Moore. Or would you choose another path? Leave a comment, and let me know you're still riding with this story. That morning, the sky hung gray and heavy, the prairie wind driving walls of red dust across the land. Inside the cabin, Eliza was folding blankets when the sound reached her. Hoofbeats. Not one horse, but several. The rhythm was steady, deliberate, and it struck her chest like a warning bell. She rushed to the doorway, heart pounding. Through the haze of dust, 3 riders emerged. They came straight for the cabin, not hurried, not reckless, but with the quiet arrogance of men who feared nothing. The Harrington brothers. The eldest rode in front, broad-shouldered, a scar slashing across his cheek. His younger kin followed, eyes gleaming with scorn and violence. Their horses stamped hard as they pulled up before the porch, the men sitting tall in their saddles, wearing smirks like blades. So it's true, one of them rasped, laughter grating. The land thief's daughter, hiding out in a shack. A girl like you's only got one fate. Eliza froze, lips pressed tight. Each word struck like a lash, reopening wounds of dignity long trampled. She took one step back, but behind her was only the cabin door. No escape. Bootsteps thudded against the porch. Jonah Reed stepped into view, his eyes sharp as gun steel as they cut across each face. He stood tall, hand near the grip of his revolver, his voice carrying low and steady. She doesn't belong to you. She doesn't belong to anyone. The air snapped tight, a bowstring drawn to breaking. The Harringtons narrowed their eyes, fingers twitching near their holsters. A hard gust tore through, swirling red dust around the porch, as though the earth itself was holding its breath for the first shot. The eldest Harrington bared his yellowed teeth in a grin. Reed, you're a damn fool. You think you can stand against the Harrington name? Jonah said nothing. His silence burned hotter than words, and that silence needled at them like a knife. Eliza glanced sideways. His jaw was locked, his hand already resting firm on the gun's grip, ready to clear leather in an instant. The seconds dragged long and brutal. The 3 brothers sneered, but tension rippled in every twitch. A spark, just one, and the porch would drown in gunfire. Eliza clutched the doorframe, heart slamming, knowing one blink, one mistake, and blood would paint the threshold. This time there would be no retreat. Then, at last, the eldest brother shifted. His grin lingered, but calculation flashed in his eyes. He didn't draw. Instead, he tugged his reins, turning his horse in a slow circle. His brothers followed, eyes still burning holes through the cabin. The spell broke in a storm of hooves, red dust boiling up beneath them. But before he rode off, the eldest leaned in his saddle, voice gravel deep, each word dragging like a knife across bone. "Reed, you think you can hide it forever? Don't forget, you still owe the Harringtons. A life, unpaid." Jonah stiffened. For an instant, Eliza saw his face falter, just a flicker, gone as quickly as it came. He clenched his jaw again, standing firm, eyes gone dark as midnight. He gave no answer, only watched, silent as stone, until the three riders vanished into the storm of dust. Eliza gasped for air, her hands trembling against the rough wood. When the last hoofbeat faded, she turned toward Jonah. His face was cold, but his eyes carried something heavier, anger, yes, but also a weight she couldn't name. "Jonah," her voice quivered, fragile as glass. "They'll come back, won't they?" Jonah met her gaze. No lies in his eyes, no dodging, only the raw truth. "Yeah, and next time, it won't be words." Eliza's throat closed. The ground seemed to sway beneath her feet. Terror surged through her, but mingled with it was a strange, burning certainty. Jonah wasn't leaving. His answer, harsh as it was, meant he had chosen to stay, to face what came. Yet Harrington's words gnawed at her. A life unpaid. What did it mean? She moved closer, ready to ask, but Jonah's shoulders were taut, his eyes staring into a horizon only he could see, as if reliving a memory he wasn't ready to share. And she understood. Now was not the time. Wind howled through the cabin's cracks, floorboards creaking like a lament. Eliza laid her hand on the table, fingers trembling. She didn't know what sin Jonah carried from his past with the Harrington clan. She only knew that truth was tightening the noose around them both. The sky dimmed, casting a pale, blood-red glow across the cabin walls. Eliza closed her eyes, one question burning in her chest. Could they withstand it, when their enemies brought not just lust and greed, but vengeance old as sin? So tell me this. If you stood there, whose side would you take? A. Jonah Reed. Eliza Moore, or would you choose another path? Leave a comment and let me know you're still riding with this story. 2 days later, a morning that seemed calm was ripped apart by the thunder of hoofbeats. Eliza jumped, the sewing needle slipping from her fingers, clattering across the wooden floor. Jonah had heard it first. He was already on his feet, hand resting on the revolver at his hip, his eyes dark as the sky before a storm. Dust boiled up from the prairie. Then out of the haze came 5 riders, their horses pounding in formation. At the front rode the eldest Harrington, the scar on his cheek stark against his grim face. His brothers flanked him, and beside them 2 hired guns, strangers, but with the hungry, violent eyes of men who'd killed for pay. 5 pistols glinted like fangs in the sunlight. They reined in, forming a half circle before the porch. The eldest Harrington sneered, lips curling with malice. "Game's over, Reed. Step aside and let us take back what's ours." Inside, Eliza clutched at her sleeve, knees trembling. But when Jonah pushed the door open and strode onto the porch, gun steady in hand, she drew a breath, forcing every shred of fear down. For the first time, Eliza stepped out beside him, voice carrying strong into the dusty air. "I don't belong to you. I never did." The words cut the silence like a blade. The 5 men stiffened, their eyes flaring with rage. The youngest Harrington spat, his voice a growl. "Whore, you dare defy us?" Jonah stepped forward half a pace, his voice low, resonant, unshakable. "She belongs to no one, and you'll never lay hands on her again." The stillness lasted the beat of a heart. Then the first shot cracked the air. Gunfire roared. Bullets split the dust, the sound slamming across the prairie. Jonah moved with lethal precision, rolling off the porch, revolver raised, firing 2 rounds in the same breath. Both hired guns toppled from their saddles, horses screaming, hooves thrashing as their riders lay still. Eliza ducked, covering her head, but her eyes clung to Jonah. Every movement of his body was deadly, controlled, a man molded by violence and battle. Gunsmoke thickened, acrid, tangled with the sharp tang of blood. The Harringtons shouted curses, their pistols spitting fire. Bullets tore into the cabin walls, wood splintering into flying shards. Jonah slid off the porch steps, shifted position, squeezed the trigger again. A shot tore across the eldest Harrington's arm, blood spraying as he bellowed in pain, his arrogance twisted into blind fury. But seeing his men dead in the dirt, even he knew the fight was lost. "Fall back!" he roared, his voice shaking though he tried to sound proud. The 3 survivors yanked their reins, horses wheeling in chaos, red dust clouding around them. Eliza's breath came ragged, her knees buckling. Jonah held his aim until the last of them vanished into the haze. 2 bodies lay still in the dirt, blood soaking into the thirsty earth. The stench of iron lingered heavy over the porch. Eliza looked up at Jonah, her eyes wet with tears, yet lit by a strange spark. Fear, yes, but trust as well. His choice was clear now. He had decided to stand, to fight, to never run again. The smoke thinned, leaving only the scorched stench of powder and the taste of blood in the air. The prairie lay silent, save for the whistle of wind and the harsh breath of the horses. On the porch, the corpses lay in shadow, the dying sun stretching long across them like a shroud. Jonah stood rigid, chest heaving, finger still brushing the trigger. Slowly, the steel in his eyes softened. Eliza stepped forward, legs shaking, hand trembling as it touched his arm. She felt his skin hot, the blood pulsing beneath scarred flesh. They said nothing. Silence carried the weight of everything unsaid. Eliza's tears fell unchecked, but for the first time in weeks, they weren't born of terror or despair. She understood now. He wasn't here because of debt, or guilt, or ghosts. He was here because he'd chosen her. Jonah exhaled, lowering the revolver. He turned to her, eyes no longer shadowed, but resolute. His voice was hoarse, scraped raw by sleepless nights, but every word rang clear. "I stay, not for what I owe. I stay for you." Eliza froze, breath caught. Tears streaked her cheeks, but her heart surged with something new: release, belief, hope. She pressed her hand to his face, tracing the scars, the story etched into his skin. "Jonah." Her voice trembled, yet her eyes burned bright. "For the first time, I believe we can live, not just run." He nodded once. No more words. That single nod was a vow, unshakable. The cabin, once nothing more than a hideout, had become their home. No longer 2 strays bound only by survival, but a pair who had chosen to stand together, whatever storms came next. Outside, the sky began to clear, dust settling across the plain. Eliza lifted her eyes, still trembling, yet steadier than ever before. For the first time since she'd lost her parents, she felt the weight of safety, the strength of a shoulder beside her, not forced by fear, but chosen by love. The tale closes in the hush of the prairie, but its echo lingers. Jonah stayed, not for debts of the past, but for a home, for Eliza. The little cabin, once a refuge, now stood as a symbol of courage and faith. That no matter how heavy the past, a soul can still find peace when it chooses to stand with another. And you, if it were your choice, would you ride away to escape danger or stay and fight for the one you love? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you've been riding with me through this frontier tale, give it a like, hit subscribe, and ring the bell so you won't miss the next journey west. Until then, partner.